Wednesday, August 28th, 2024, and we are 68 days away from the election. Welcome to today's Make It Make Sense mini episode. I'm Grant Herms. On today's episode, 2 new court filings in major Trump cases that might bring them back from the brink of death. That's a little harsh. Maybe just bringing them out of limbo. And before we get going here, there is one other piece of news. After what will be 38 days of being the Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris is finally sitting down for a full interview. She's sitting down with Dana Bash from CNN tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Tomorrow's mini and Friday's episode will be all about Harris's first sit-down. I just wanted you to know that I knew that it was happening, and now you know that it's happening, and if you want to watch it, you can and should. Okay, back to the court cases. On Monday, Special Prosecutor Jack Smith appealed the decision to have the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case reinstated. That was the case, if you don't remember, where the FBI found that Donald Trump was keeping thousands of documents and hundreds of classified documents that were taken from the White House at his Mar-a-Lago home in Florida. Trump took those while he was leaving office. Now, Trump was charged with 40 felony counts of mishandling classified documents. Trump maintains that he was and is allowed to have them because they were taken when he was technically still president. The National Archives and the Department of Justice don't agree with that, and Trump repeatedly fought archives requests and then an official FBI subpoena to comply with federal law surrounding those classified documents. I want to say here that about 90 classified documents were found in Joe Biden's home, and several were found at Vice President Mike Pence's home. It's not uncommon for this kind of a thing to happen, for these documents to accidentally get packed up during a presidential transition. There's a lot going on, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of things people don't see. And when it does happen, usually they're handed over right away to the National Archives. Technically, they belong to the people. Biden and Pence consented to being searched by the FBI, and they complied with DOJ requests to have their documents returned. Trump did not doing that despite giving multiple chances, and that is why this case is different. Okay, so the federal judge in that case in Florida, Judge Eileen Cannon, who was appointed by Trump, has routinely been more favorable to him than what most legal scholars and even other judges would have expected, with some of them saying that she's risking her own career by being too deferential to Trump. Now, last month, she threw out this case, citing an opinion, a single opinion from a single Supreme Court justice, Justice Clarence Thomas, who was one of the most conservative justices on the Supreme Court. She said that Jack Smith was illegitimately appointed by the U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland, who leads the Department of Justice, because it wasn't approved by Congress, meaning that Smith was appointed by Merrick Garland, and that had to go through Congress. It was a stunning decision, and one that was roundly considered to be extremely flawed, with one professor from NYU calling it bonkers, saying that she was just making things up. So Monday, Jack Smith filed an appeal to get that case reinstated. He sent that appeal to the Court of Appeals above Eileen Cannon's court, asking them to make her put this case back in play. In his filing, he says there are at least 4 different laws that allow for Merrick Garland to appoint special counsels and special prosecutors, and attorneys general going all the way back to the Civil War have been appointing them, specifically saying that both the case against Robert E. Lee and what would have been the case against John Wilkes Booth before he died were investigated and carried out by special counsels. Now, if this case does go back to Cannon's courtroom, legal experts say there's a good chance the appeals court might kick Cannon off this case, which would be a huge blow to her career. She couldn't be kicked off the bench. Federal judges are appointed for life by presidents, but once they're appointed, many of them start getting eyes for a possible Supreme Court seat if and when they come open. So being thrown off of this case by an appeals court, any case really, but this case in particular, would be a scandal for her, not to mention a scandal for the overall federal bench. Now, the Trump campaign has a month to respond, and Smith is asking for there to be open arguments in court so things like this don't play out in just paperwork. Then there was another huge filing from Smith in a different case. That happened on Tuesday. And this is the case that charges Trump with plotting to overturn the 2020 election, including his involvement in January 6th. Initially, a grand jury said that Trump should be indicted, and this is a jury of his peers, right? He was indicted on 4 counts: conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to violate civil rights of Americans, and 2 counts of conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, which would have been the certification of the 2020 election by the campaign getting Republicans in other states to forge official documents saying Trump had won their state instead of Biden, or instances like Trump being caught on tape asking the governor of Georgia to make up votes for him. And it's worth saying here that a lot of the people involved in that part of this case have been charged in their own right in those individual states. So that case was filed nearly 13 months ago, but it's been on hold since about February, since the case on whether Donald Trump had immunity from being charged with any crimes for things he did while he was president was working its way through the courts. Now, that made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which decided on July 1st that presidents were immune from being prosecuted for essentially anything that presidents considered to be an official act as president, and they don't need to prove, nor can they be asked or investigated by someone like a special prosecutor about those quote-unquote official acts. So not actual total immunity, but in practice, pretty much total immunity. It's all part of a legal theory that's gained a lot of traction on the far right and now the mainstream right over the last 50 years or so. It's called the unitary power of the president. It's kind of complicated. I'm not going to tell you a whole lot about this because that would just get a little confusing, but essentially it means that the president can't do anything wrong or illegal because the way the office of the president is described in the Constitution says that they're always acting on behalf of the people no matter what they do. There are a lot of constitutional scholars and professors and people who look at this seriously and say that's just not really what this was about, but regardless, that is sort of the legal theory that they're looking at here. That line of thinking, though, led to this exchange in Trump's case where the Supreme Court justice asked if a sitting U.S. president could kill a political opponent, and Trump's lawyer didn't outright say no.
If the president decides that his rival is a corrupt person and he orders the military or orders someone to assassinate him, is that within his official acts that for which he can get immunity?
It would depend on the hypothetical, but we can see that could well be an official act.
It could, and why? Because he's doing it for personal reasons. He's not doing it like President Obama is alleged to have done it, to protect the country from a terrorist. He's doing it for personal gain. And isn't that the nature of the allegations here? That he's not doing these acts in furtherance of an official responsibility. He's doing it for personal gain.
Okay, so once the Supreme Court ruled that the president had immunity, it obviously threw the entire case against Trump surrounding the 2020 election subversion stuff out the window. Well, yesterday, Jack Smith filed what's called a superseding indictment, and all that means is that it's a new indictment that had revisions. Like, instead of saying things like Donald Trump was president, he says Donald Trump was a candidate for president in 2020 and dropped details about conversations Trump had that happened at the White House or work he did with people who were then advisors or worked in the Department of Justice, though it's unclear right now if that's enough to fit inside the narrow set of things the Supreme Court decision will allow Trump to be charged with. The new indictment, though, isn't just Smith revising and dropping charges. Instead, he brought a new argument to a new grand jury, so a totally different group of Americans who hadn't seen the facts of this case yet, and they still came back saying Trump should be indicted. Yes, there's an old adage that getting a grand jury to bring back an indictment is so easy a prosecutor could indict a ham sandwich. That's not really true, but it's worth saying that a second grand jury found that there was enough evidence that Trump needed to be on trial at the very least for what we saw and heard happen in the days, weeks, and months after the 2020 election. Now, Trump also threw a fit on his social media site, Truth Social, firing off 8 very long posts about the new filings, saying the cases should be dismissed immediately. He's continued to call Jack Smith deranged. He called it election interference, a direct assault on democracy, and the persecution of a political opponent. It's also worth pointing out here that Trump has called this election interference before, and this will only give him more fuel for the fire when it comes to accusing the Democratic Party of cheating in 2024, and potentially an avenue for him to contest the results of the election should he lose. He's been so vocal about this time around that the Harris campaign is already assembling a group of liberal attorneys to be ready to battle Trump in court over any election lawsuits that he might file if he loses. So this protracted fight that happened last time in 2020 might not happen again. That's not related to these cases we're talking about, but it is something that you should just know is going on behind the scenes for right now. The filing in this 2020 case come just a few days before both sides were supposed to come together to decide the fate of the case next week, and both of these filings come just 9 days before the Department of Justice's 60-day rule. It's not an official rule. It's some informal thing that the DOJ says they need to stop work on cases that might have implications on the election 60 days before Election Day. So Jack Smith really got this in under the wire. Now, the last thing that I'll say here is that there's a chance that none of this ends up mattering. See, the Trump legal team has filed for delay after delay in both the classified documents case and the election subversion case, and mostly it's worked. There are a lot of people who thought that these cases might have started and maybe would have been over with by now, but they are still in the paperwork back and forth stages. There were a lot of people who were also hoping that these cases would be over by now, one way or another, so that Trump would have his days in court and give voters a chance to have some resolution on these things that made such huge news. And that's just not really going to happen right now for either of those cases. Courts just don't move that quickly, especially not on something this important when you're talking about a former president. And if Trump wins in November, he has vowed to have his attorney general drop the cases and walk away. So in a way, these filings were really the last-ditch efforts for Jack Smith. That is it for today's Mims Mini. Please rate and review the show on your podcast app if you haven't already. Don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube as well. And also subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got bonus content and more articles, including a new one up today, or that will be up today if it hasn't dropped already, about the United States' addiction to classifying documents. It's something that I think about all the time when I cover this Trump documents case. Also, share this show and the Substack if you want to on social media at Mims News Pod. It's MIMS News Pod. It's all one word on every platform you're all on. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.